All right. Hello, everyone. How was everybody's long weekend? I worked as well. A little bit. Salem, like the Salem with the witches? Oh, wow. Interesting. That's a very interesting time of year uh to have the opportunity to visit there. Such a spooky time of year. Oh, mine was all right. I mostly worked and cooked dinner. I really upped my gravy game this year. So, a couple housekeeping things before we get started. Um, we're going to start the chapter on perception today. But of course, all of you will have gotten your marks back for your quizzes. If you have any questions about your grades, um, it's a good idea to ask the person who marked your paper directly. Um, when it comes to particular questions, that is. And you can see which TA, whether it was myself or one of the TAs, on your quiz, when you look up the results. I've also posted a link that gives you instructions on how to view quiz results if you're not sure how. So that link is there in the announcement I posted. You can also Google the instructions if you need to. If you have particular questions about quizzes in general, or study tips, or anything like that, then I encourage you to reach out to me. So if you have questions about, okay, so and so marked my test, can you explain why I got the mark I did? You want to ask the person who graded it. If you have questions about the quizzes in general, how to approach them, how to study, etc., contact me and we'll set up a meeting. We can have some office hours and kind of talk about study strategies, etc. But on the whole, I was very impressed with what I saw. Um, the next quiz, quiz number two, as of now is open. And what it covers is basically from where the previous one left off, all the way up to the end of last week. So, um, well, not the end of last week, not the essay writing stuff, obviously, but from the chapter on knowledge, chapter two, immediately after the Gettier cases stuff. So the Gettier cases were covered on this quiz, the first quiz. Um, so the rest of chapter two, chapter three, which is theories of justification, and chapter four, new directions in epistemology. That is what the next quiz covers. Um, and that's due by the end of the week. It's the same as before, though. Open book, you have 90 minutes once you begin. Do study before, because of the time limit, right? You don't want to be like frantically flipping through your notes and stuff. I actually don't know, offhand what that was. I could look it up later, but yeah, I don't really know right now. And yeah, no, this material will not be on quiz two. This material will appear later on quiz three. So you don't have to worry about what we're covering today or tomorrow. But it's just the sort of last little bit of chapter two, um, chapter three, and chapter four. Yeah, so that's what we'll cover. And today, we're going to begin a very interesting topic, and that is perception. No, the quizzes aren't cumulative. I mean, it's always a good idea to keep the earlier chapters fresh in your mind, but that's not what I'm quizzing you on. I'm just going to quiz you on what we've done subsequent to the previous quiz. So today, yes, a very interesting topic, perception. So perception, the way we well, I guess we could describe perception as the way in which we are in contact with the world. Um, and we can think about the ways in which this is so, right? I look around right now and I'm having delivered to me information about the world and all of the objects in the world. All of this information is being delivered to me by my various senses. Of course, my senses can also deliver information about my own internal states, but for now, let's talk about senses putting me in contact with the world, right? I look over here and I see some plants on a plant stand. I smell the cup of coffee that I always have on my desk. It's pretty good. I look over here again and there's a cat. He's just finished breakfast. And well, what else? I can kind of hear the traffic outside, right? Um, as far as the internal stuff goes, I've got introspection. I can tell what I'm thinking about. I can know that I am perceiving what I am perceiving, the plant, the coffee, the cat, etc. We've got like proprioception and kinesthesia and stuff, so I know I'm sitting here on the couch in my living room lecturing to you. Um, and there are actually quite a lot of assumptions baked into the idea that the senses are delivering information about the world to us in this way, right? I mean, you can all do the same thing wherever you are now. Stop and focus on what you're perceiving, and notice that you're probably taking for granted that there are physical objects out there in the world, which is very natural, right? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean, Professor Redstone? I'm taking for granted the existence of external objects. What? But of course there are external objects, you might say. We're also taking for granted that those things are mind independent and publicly accessible. So, um, the coffee cup, um, continues to exist even with no one around to perceive it. It's mind independent in that sense, and it's publicly accessible in the sense that it's available for everyone to perceive. It's not some kind of magic coffee cup that only I can see. It's an object in the world that anyone could look at if they chose, if they were in the right place at the right time. If you were here in my living room, you'd see it too. We also sometimes, perhaps, at least in my case, I'm not sure that this is such a baked-in assumption as it is for others, but I could be wrong about that. But another assumption is that the qualities we sense, what we could call the sensible properties, are in the objects themselves, right? So, for example, the sensible quality of fuzziness of this fellow right here is in the object itself, is in the cat. It is the cat itself that is fuzzy and brown and white, etc. Or this mug, kind of a whitish um, porcelain thing with speckles on it. These qualities, these sensible properties are in the object. So what I've described to you now, we call naive realism, or it's a type of direct realism, but we call it naive realism. Um, Naive realism is the somewhat naive. It's naive in the philosophical sense. Naive here means that this is the way it seems to us, that there are physical objects which are mind independent, publicly accessible, and that the sensory properties we perceive are, or sensible properties we perceive are actually in the objects. This is the naive view. It's naive because it's the way it seems to us before we actually think about it. So maybe a lot of us think about perception in this way. But if we think about it, um, we start to see problems. I mean, maybe I should put the question to you though. Is this how you think of um, perception working? Would you say that you take for granted that there are mind independent, publicly accessible physical objects which feature the sensible properties that we perceive? What do we think? We certainly talk this way. Yeah, Quinn says yes. Kayla's still processing. That's okay. It's kind of like, okay, look, hey, Kitty, if I say the apple is red, it's like I'm saying, by saying the apple is red, I'm predicating a property to the apple, redness. So the apple has this property, redness, which I predicate to it. It kind of sounds like the redness is in the apple or part of the apple, right? And the apple is there, mind independent and publicly accessible, sitting in the fruit bowl or wherever, right? Yeah, Remy, I mean, ultimately, you're right. I think you're right. And that's where we're going with this, really, is that um, what I'm in contact with is sure it's the world, but it's indirect. I'm in indirect contact with it. Because what I'm actually experiencing right now is a mental representation of the world, not the world itself, right? So yeah, this is naive realism. If I look at an apple in the fruit bowl and I say, okay, well, what I'm seeing is the actual apple and its various properties, like its redness, are there in the apple out there in the world. Then what I am committed to is something called naive realism, which again is a form of direct realism, which says that we directly um, perceive the world. And the world is mind independent, right? Objects are really out there. They exist whether anyone is around to perceive them. I hate that old riddle, as you know. Well, maybe I haven't gone on this rant in this class yet. It's probably my other class that I've ranted on this, but there is the old riddle, right? If a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? A realist would say, of course it does, because there really is a tree out there. It doesn't matter if there's anyone around to hear it fall. Um, but again, this is the naive view. Naive, maybe it would be kinder, in a sense, to call this common sense realism. But alas, uh, we've kind of taken to call it naive realism. Okay, that's an interesting question, Kaya. Yeah. This is actually kind of true, right? In terms of neurological processes, um, there's a theory in consciousness, Benjamin Liebei's theory, the time on theory of consciousness, which says that for us to become consciously aware of something takes about, or well, it takes at least half a second of neuronal activity. So the relevant groups of neurons have to be firing for half a second, 500 milliseconds. But we don't experience a delay. We don't experience a half-second delay. Like a half-second delay is long enough that we would notice it. Um, so the theory goes that the brain antedates it. Uh, so subjectively refers the experience back in time by about half a second, so that we don't notice, right? That's the theory, right? This was initially investigated by patients undergoing brain surgery who had consented to participate in an experiment. But this kind of surgery where the whole, skull is exposed, or the whole skull is open and the brain exposed, these are quite rare nowadays. So, um, it's very difficult to replicate this. So there might be a delay, but we already don't experience it, according to some theories. Um, would it make it more real? You've always got to keep in mind that in philosophy, real means mind independent, not fake, right? Remember we were talking about social constructs last time before the essay writing lecture? And some people say social constructs are not real. Well, that doesn't mean they're not an actual thing, right? Like money is a social construct. Um, but just because it's a social construct doesn't mean it's not something. So real just means mind independent. It doesn't mean authentic in philosophy. So Karen asks, what if you're colorblind? Yeah, okay. Does the color I see perceive still belong to the object if we're talking about naive realism, or does that property depend on who's perceiving? Well, that's kind of where, again, that's where we're going with this. Um, the redness of the apple isn't in the apple or part of the apple. It's part of the mind of the perceiver, right? Kind of like remember when we looked at the picture of the dress, and some of you saw it as blue and black, and others saw it as white and gold. It's kind of like that. So, so that's naive realism. It's a kind of direct realism, and as Crumley says, like not every philosopher makes this distinction. Some philosophers, in fact, this is the way I learned it. Um, just treat naive realism and direct realism as the exact same thing. But Crumley treats it a little bit differently. Direct realism is perhaps a little bit less naive on Crumley's treatment of it than naive realism. I mean, I might be directly aware of real objects, even without those properties belonging to the objects, but they're still real in the sense that, green isn't in that plant over there, but it's real in the sense that it's the wavelengths of light reflecting off of the plant leaves that cause the experience of green in me, right? Yeah, kind of like what Matthew just said actually in the chat. You took the words right out of my mouth. So Matthew, sorry, I'm pronouncing your name wrong. The redness of the apple might be an internal interpretation of our mind, but aren't the waves coming from the apple? Yes, but those are the physical properties, not the qualia. So the qualia are the subjective first person sort of aspects of our experience, like the redness of red. This is called a quale. I'm actually surprised that qualia do not get a mention in this chapter, on the second reading of it. But the qualia are in the mind. The qualia are not real. They're mind dependent. But yes, the wavelengths of light, the properties of the surface, like of an object, the way it reflects light and absorbs, like it reflects certain wavelengths, absorbs other wavelengths. Yes, those are real. But then think about, somebody who's colorblind, all of those properties, the reflectance properties, the wavelengths of light, etc., are all out there in the world. But for somebody who's colorblind, they're not going to have the same experience of that color necessarily. They might see it in gray or something, right? Well, this is really getting us to the questions I wanted to ask here, right? Why are critics critical of direct realism? Well, direct perception isn't very direct, as we've seen, right? It's not like my eyes are cameras and I just open my eyes and there's someone in here that can view everything through the lenses of the cameras, right? It's much less direct than that. And does it really make sense to say that the sensible qualities are in objects? Again, it might seem that way on a common sense view, like the green of the leaves on this plant is really in the leaves or on the leaves or a part of the leaves. Um, but the more we think about it, the more we realize that that just can't be true. Um, and of course, whether direct realism is or is not true has some pretty interesting epistemological implications for us, right? If I'm looking at the apple, I'm justified in believing it's red. If I see that it's red, I'm justified on the basis of that perception of forming the belief that the apple is red because redness is a property that is a part of the apple. It really is out there in the world. If direct realism or naive realism is not true, then what is my justification for believing uh that the nature of these objects in the world is the way it is, right? What is my justification for believing things are the way they are if direct realism is not true? So that's the interesting consequence for us. There are various arguments from illusion that kind of really drive this point home, right? I won't reread this bit here at the top because I've kind of already covered it. But there are these arguments from illusion that philosophers have employed that cause us to question the notion of direct realism or naive realism. So George Berkeley really is how it's pronounced, um, offered this experiment that you've probably kind of inadvertently done this yourself. But he said, put one hand in hot water and the other in cold water. And after your hands have gotten used to the temperature, take each hand out and put your hands in lukewarm water. Now, one hand will feel different than the other, right? To the hand that was in the cold water, the lukewarm water will feel hot. But to the hand that was in the hot water, the lukewarm water will feel cold. But the water can't be two different temperatures at the same time, right? So from this, Berkeley argued that, well, you're not directly perceiving the world. The water is whatever temperature it is, but now you've got one hand upon which it feels cold and another upon which it feels hot, right? And you've probably experienced this yourself. Like, imagine you come in from a very, very cold day and you try and get into the bath or the shower. Or better yet, if you've ever gone from like a hot tub to a swimming pool, back and forth, right? You get out of the hot tub, and all of a sudden the air feels incredibly chilly. And you get in the pool, and the pool is chilly. But then you get used to the pool. Then you go back in the hot tub, and all of a sudden the hot tub feels really, really hot because you were just in the pool, right? Same thing. Same idea here. Yeah, perception you could think of as kind of like as the as the cognitive process by which we sense the world and interpret those sensations. Exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. A lot of this is very closely related to psychology, of course, and neurology as well. Although we're not getting so far into those details. We're trying to keep it philosophical, but there is a lot of overlap. Absolutely. So Barkley is saying, like, look, you got your bucket of hot water, your bucket of cold water, leave your hands in there until they get used to it. Put them in the lukewarm water, and you'll have two different sensations, one on each hand. Um, but that third bucket of water is not two different temperatures. So We must be representing the world differently in each hand because one was used to the cold water and one was used to the hot water. There's the very famous, bent stick, right? Like if you take a stick that's perfectly straight and stick it in some water, it'll appear bent where it goes into the water because the water refracts light at a different angle than air. So we know the stick is straight, but our senses tell us it's bent, even though we know it's not. We know it's an illusion caused by the way that water and air differently refract light. Uh, I hope your cat finds this interesting.
She's very intently watching.
Oh, really? I
Yeah,
wonder if perhaps he saw my cat earlier.
I don't know, but she likes to sit on my desk and watch her lectures. She's here, like you can see her ears right now.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, well, I hope she learned something. I love cats. I love dogs too. Um, where'd the chat go? Ah, here it is. Um, well, I don't know about the Matthew. I don't really know about the physics of this, or maybe this is the psychophysics of this. This is actually something that would have been studied by the psychophysicists, early psychologists in the 19th century who studied the relationship between like objective stimuli in the world. So wavelengths of light, frequency of sound waves in the atmosphere, temperature of water, um, mass, and they study the relationship between those things and our perception of them. So, like the relation between mass and perceived heaviness, or different wavelengths of light and color. So they studied that, and they would have probably also studied the perceived intensity of temperature. But as far as formulas and stuff go, I don't know that side of things. Um, the point for us is that the water that you place your hands in after one's been sitting in the hot and one in the cold feels different on each hand, but it can't be a different temperature on each hand because it's in the same bucket. They're both in the same bucket of water. So it's an illusion, right? The mind can't be representing the world directly if these things happen. Or Bertrand Russell, right? He says, if you look at objects from a different perspective, they can look different. So look at a book or a table, change the perspective. It might appear square or diamond shaped, depending on where you're standing relative to the thing that you're looking at, right? Um, so again, how things appear to us, the phenomena, are probably not exactly, at least our perceptions of things are not exactly the way those things really are, if indeed they exist. And some deny that they are mind independent, publicly accessible objects in the first place, like George Berkeley. We'll cover Berkeley later, but there are also perceptual illusions, which are fun. So let's look at some perceptual illusions. This first one is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. So you've probably seen this before. Who wants to tell me what's going on here? First of all, look at the lines. Like, look at these lines, the horizontal lines. What do they appear like to you? Are they the same or different length? Yeah. Yeah, they're both the same, but they don't quite look like it. April?
Yeah, I was gonna say with the arrows and the way that the arrows are placed on the line is the same length. It's just the arrows and how they're placed that make the bottom one look longer than the top one.
Yeah. And you could even check it with a ruler, right? Like you could, if you had a ruler handy, you could measure the screen, measure the lines on the screen, and you could see that they are actually the same length. Yeah, yeah, and like Kaya says, even though you know it's an illusion, you nonetheless continue to experience it. And this is probably like you said, the way that these arrows go. Um, this is an illusion that you're particularly vulnerable to if you've grown up in an environment with a lot of right angles. Um, People who live in cultures where there are far fewer right angles, maybe you grew up in a yurt instead of a house, right? Um, you're probably going to be less susceptible to this. And the reasons for that are interesting, but they suggest that maybe this illusion has something to do with how we understand um, depth and perspective and so forth. In any case, it's a cognitively impenetrable illusion, which means that it's probably like lower level mechanisms in the visual areas of the brain that are responsible for creating this. And these are cognitively impenetrable, meaning that even though I know it's an illusion, I can't just make myself stop experiencing it, right? So my cognition can't penetrate those lower level mechanisms and alter them such that I don't experience the illusion anymore. That's what this cognitive impenetrability means. Let's take a look at another one. This is a fun one. This is the cafe wall illusion, and this actually comes from a real life example of a cafe that used to be frequented by the psychologist Richard Gregory. Now these lines, if you look at the wall, the lines appear to be kind of all askew, right? But these lines are actually straight. So it's just because the way the black and white tiles are set, that these perfectly straight horizontal lines look all wonky. And again, this is from a real cafe. That someone had done the tiles on the wall this way, and everybody was like, "Oh, the tiles are all funky," and it's kind of a cool trick to play. If you're the cafe owner, you can say, "No, they're not. They're, they're straight, right?" You can check, hold a ruler up, hold a level up, right? You can see that they're actually straight. Who is experiencing this illusion right now as you stare at it? Do the lines appear all weird and Ooh, let's see. Yeah, okay. Yeah, they all look wonky to everybody. That's right. That's how it's supposed to look. And again, lower level information processing systems in our visual pathways probably what are responsible for this. Yeah. It was funny, like when this is from uh I took this image from Susan Blackmore's book on consciousness, which is what I used for my first year seminar on consciousness studies. And I used to have a smaller laptop, and I would read the chapters online, like PDF files from the library. And when the image is too small, I couldn't see it. So if you backed way up, actually, as I back up, it looks more wonky. Um, but there are certain conditions under which maybe you wouldn't experience the illusion. Yeah, like Quinn says, if you focus on one line, like I'll just look at the top. Yeah, but everything else still looks wonky. Um, but if these tiles were differently aligned, like if instead of kind of offset, just the space in between here, immediately below, was a black tile. If it alternated like a checkerboard or a chessboard, you wouldn't see the wonky lines. It's really, really cool. This is another one, the Ebbinghaus illusion. You've probably all seen this one before. But the idea is that these two blue circles appear to be different sizes. So it looks like we've got a small blue circle surrounded by big white circles, and then a big blue circle surrounded by small white circles. But of course, these blue circles are actually the same size. And you could check with a ruler if you wanted to, and you could see that they are actually the same size. So that's fun. Ebbinghaus illusion. Here's one of my favorites, neon color spreading. Who can see the blue circle? A sort of neon blue circle. Yeah. Of course, there is no blue circle, right? Um, this is a fun one because the only blue in this image are these blue lines that connect up with the black lines here in these circles. This blue circle, like it appears to be kind of bluish in these white spaces here when I look at this. But of course, there's no blue there. And you could check that by, actually covering the blue on your screen, the blue lines, and you'd see there's no blue circle there. So these are all quite fun. Perceptual illusions. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Joey, you're right. On our screens all only have basically three colors, right? Um, but we can combine them in various ways to create all kinds of other colors. I mean, this kind of stuff, it's how a lot of things work. I mean, you couldn't watch television. I know that today we have higher frame rates than just um, whatever 24 or 26 frames per second, that whatever the classic frame rate is. Um, but it's thanks to the way our brains work that we see a series of still images played fast enough as a moving image. If you showed like you could show a human being a piece of animation, and they'll see it as not a series of images but as a moving image. You could show that same piece of animation to a bird and they would not see a moving image because birds have a what I playfully refer to as a different refresh rate than we do. And that's because birds need to be able to navigate through, trees and branches and so forth when they're flying quickly. So, if you showed an animated film to a pigeon, the pigeon would just see a succession of still images where we would see a moving image. So it's because your brains work this way, like Joey says, that we can see what's on the screen and have these lectures, or that we can go and watch a movie. Whoops. We can watch a film and see it as a moving picture and not a series of still images. Oh, 24 is still standard. That's good. Yeah. I don't like the, 60 frame. I mean, maybe it's different for video games. But I think when people use really high frame rates for film, it starts to make it look not like a movie. Like 24 frames per second is still the magic number. Okay, so direct realism, at least when it comes to naive realism, probably not a good idea. Yeah, Gemini Man. Do I know that movie? I don't know if I know that movie. I've maybe it sounds familiar. It is a Will Smith movie. Is that the one where he and his son are exploring another planet or something? It's got Jaden as well as Will.
Yeah.
He fights a clone of himself. Okay. Oh, the soap opera effect. Interesting. Yeah, when you upscale it. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of, I think, Cormick. You get those clips people post on social media, like what was it I saw? It was Duel of the Fates from Revenge of the Sith, where Anakin and Obi-Wan are having their big final lightsaber duel. someone upscaled it to 50 frames per second and it just looks weird. So, yeah, well, um, so we need an alternative to naive realism. And that alternative is indirect realism. So there are lots of different kinds of indirect realism, but what they all have in common is that the claim is there are these internal states, these mental representations, and these represent external objects, and it's on that basis that we infer their existence. So I see a red apple. I'm not seeing the apple itself, but I'm having a mental representation of the apple, which allows me to infer the existence of an apple out there in the world. And we should probably talk about the notion of sense data, which is not really a super clear idea. In fact, it's kind of fallen out of use in philosophy, but we can call the perceived qualities of the objects that we sense data. So here, the redness of the apple is a sense datum, if you like. So this comes from Bertrand Russell. And here's how he defines sense data. He said, let us give the name sense data to the things that are immediately known in sensation, such things as colors, sounds, smells, hardness, roughness, and so on. We shall give the name sensation to the experience of being immediately aware of these things. Thus, whenever we see a color, we have a sensation of the color, but the color itself is a sense datum, not a sensation. The color is that of which we are immediately aware, and the awareness itself is a sensation. So the colors that appear to be in the objects are actually sense data. And our awareness of sense data is sensation, according to Russell. So, some of the features that you'll see in theories that employ this notion of sense data are that we have various perceptual processes like sensing and perceiving. Okay, we can stop here and talk about this if that'll help. So sense data are the sensible properties of the objects that we become aware of. So the redness of an apple is a sense datum, according to Russell. And when I become aware of that redness, I have a sensation of redness. So any questions about sense data? I can talk more about it here, but if there are questions. So, one feature of these theories that feature sense data is that they divide these processes into sensing and perceiving. So sensing is more like just kind of what it sounds like. Um, you sense hot and cold, light and dark. You perceive objects, right? So you think of sensation as like trying to get closer to a light source. Like you're just detecting how bright it is and you're trying to make it be brighter. So you just kind of move yourself such that it continuously gets brighter until you get to the light source. Sort of like a moth to a flame, right? The moth, we could maybe say is not really perceiving, but sensing. Um, because what the moth is trying to do is follow the light of the moon, but it can't tell the difference between the candle and the light of the moon. So it inadvertently flies into the candle's flame and burns to death, right? So where the moth is just sensing brightness and darkness, we are actually perceiving objects like candles, moons, etc. So Sensing is about sensing, about sensation, and perceiving is about identifying objects. The way Crumley talks about it, like perception is more conceptual in that we apply concepts to identify the objects themselves. So like, if I'm sensing this, it's like, okay, it's hard, it's cylindrical, makes a noise, okay. But then I apply a concept. I go, oh, this matches my concept of a coffee cup. This is a coffee cup. It's caused my coffee cup detector to go, bzz, you've got a coffee cup, right? So that's the difference. Sense data again are not, unlike direct realism or naive realism, sense data are not in the objects we perceive. They are mental objects. Sense data are mind independent, are mind dependent. Sorry, because they are mental representations. And like I hinted at a moment ago, experience or sensation can be conceptualized or unconceptualized. So, conceptualized is when a concept is applied. A concept is a mental item, what a psychologist may have at one point called a schema. Um, right, a mental idea, a mental blueprint. Um, that can be, for lack of a better term, compared against the objects of sensation such that we can identify those objects, right? You can have conceptual content and non-conceptual content, according to some theorists. So, I don't have my philosophy book with me, but imagine I did. There was a book in front of me on the coffee table. What am I actually sensing or perceiving here? Is my experience of looking at that book, my perceiving that book, am I perceiving the book itself or a mental representation of the book? Yeah, if I picked up the book, I would be sensing its hardness. Well, we'll get to the unconceptualized stuff. But yeah, like Jeremiah is saying, if I'm smelling it or feeling its weight in my hand, or looking at its shape, I'm sensing it. When I identify it as my philosophy book, now I'm perceiving it. But all of this, the way it looks, the way it feels in my hands, the way it smells, all of that is a mental representation. All of that um is in my mind. And I'm only in indirect perceptual contact with the book. If I recognize it as a book, then I'm perceiving my perception is a sort of conceptual, it has conceptual content. But if I was just, imagine I was feeling around on the coffee table in the dark and I wasn't quite sure what it was, then it might be unconceptualized to a certain extent. So are we all right with this notion of sense data? Well, it's still indirect. Is that what you're asking, Chloe? Like if you're perceiving your body, is that direct? Is that what you mean? Yeah. It might seem that way, but it's still a mental representation, right? Like if I, you know, get tapped on the wrist like this, that sensation, that tapping sensation is still represented in my mind because nerve signals have to travel through the nerves and make it to what's called the somatosensory cortex, which is a part of the brain that represents the body. And then neurons have to fire there. So neurons in that area of the brain that correspond to my left hand, actually they'd be on this side because of the contralateral organization of the brain, have to fire, and that is the physical basis for my representation of this tapping sensation on my hand. So even in your own body, it's not direct.
So like what would be direct?
Those weird bowls at Halloween. Uh, what weird bowls? Like where you put your hand in and you don't know what's in it? It could be, oh, Jello for brains. Yeah, gross. Yeah. Yeah, that would be yeah, like that's actually a really good idea. A really good, yeah, you put your hand in to the jar and you don't know what's in there and you can't see it. And at first it feels like something, but you don't know what exactly it feels like. That's a really good example of unconceptualized mental content. That's really good. Yeah. And we've all had that sensation, right? At some point or another where we're kind of like, what is this? And then, or like when you see, or like when concepts flip, like you might see a stick and think, oh, it's a stick. And then it starts to move. And for a second, you're like, what the? And then you realize it's not a stick, it's an insect or a snake or a bird or some camouflaged animal, right? And you have that sort of like uncanny valley moment when that first concept disappears right before the second one is applied. That split second where you don't know what the heck is going on and you feel all weird and eerie, right? So good example there. What else was in the chat? Oh yeah, speaking, yeah. So, well, this is the neuroscience. I don't want to, because this is not a neuroscience class, but I have taught a neuroscience class, so I'll throw some neuroscience in there if you want. But yeah, you can look up the sensory motor homunculus on the internet, and it's a sort of little representation of a human, but the size of the parts of the human are proportional to the sizes, like the area of the cortex where those parts are represented. So it has enormous hands because the space on the somatosensory cortex that where your hands are represented is quite large because we have lots of nerve endings in our hands, right? But that's the idea anyway. Even internal sensations, I am not even in direct sensory contact with my body on indirect realism, right? But there are problems with sense data, right? Just what on earth is a sense datum, right? The idea is a little vague. So, are they physical things? If they are, then surely they've got something to do with what's going on in the brain, like brain states. But there's nothing intrinsically red happening in my brain when I see a red apple. There's when I take a bite out of the apple and I find that it tastes sweet, there's nothing in the brain that is itself sweet, right? The problem is, and again, why I'm not I don't really see a lot of talk of qualia in this chapter, but qualia are those subjective elements of our experience, like what it's like. What it's like to taste coffee. Coffee tastes different than an apple tastes. There is a different quale to this coffee than there is to an apple. But the point is, like, there's no coffee flavor in my brain. If you look at my brain while I'm enjoying coffee, you won't find anything related to coffee in terms of taste or smell in the brain. Okay, so maybe they're non-physical. Well, how does that work? How does something non-physical have a color or a taste or a smell, right? So we don't see this notion used very often anymore, because it's a little bit hard to define, right? Is it physical? Is it non-physical? And whether it's one or the other, well, how is that supposed to work, right? So the idea works as a sort of vehicle for getting us to think about perception, but it's an idea that's mostly been dropped by philosophers of mind. The memory of the coffee you had before would still be a mental representation. Um, I guess you could still, actually, this raises another interesting question. Are sense data just data about the external world or also the internal world, like your memories? I'm tempted to say yes. So, like your memory of a coffee you had earlier today, you recall the taste, that's still a sense datum in the sense that we're talking about here. That's my intuition, but you may disagree with me. So, another kind of indirect realism is called representative realism. And again, Crumley is making some pretty fine-grained distinctions. Um, Many philosophers would say that indirect realism and representative realism are the same thing. But let's follow Crumley and treat it as distinct. So, representative realism, the only things that we're actually aware of are our representational states, our mental representations of objects in the world. These objects do exist, and they have properties that cause certain sensations in us. So here, the main difference seems to be that we've dropped the notion of sense data, like as if there are sense data out in the world making their way into the mind and making stuff happen. Here, it's properties that the objects have that cause experiences in us. So it's less about information and more about properties, I guess, is the distinction Crumley is making here. But it's kind of like some of you were saying in the chat earlier. You know, I look at the apple's skin reflects light at a particular wavelength, and that light reaches my retinas and travels down the optic tract and the optic nerve and makes it to my occipital cortex. A bunch of neurons fire, whole bunch of complicated stuff happens, and I eventually come to have a mental representation of the apple. So it's the property of the apple, you know, the way in which it reflects and absorbs different wavelengths of light that cause in me an experience of a red apple. So sometimes we also call this a causal representational theory because it's the properties of these objects that cause mental representations in us. All right. This gets us to John Locke. And I think we ought to be able to finish this before we run out of time. But John Locke was a 17th century British empiricist, and he advocated for a kind of representative realism. Now, remember, this is why it's a good idea to keep the past material in mind. Locke is an empiricist, which means anyone? Anyone? Empiricist? What does an empiricist believe? As opposed to a rationalist. Yeah. Yeah, knowledge comes from sense experience, right? And that's why all of this stuff about perception has important implications. Like, can we have knowledge from sense experience if our senses mislead us? Like, look, this is where we started. This is Descartes with his whole dream argument and demon argument. Like this stuff, this is a recurring theme. So in his essay concerning human understanding, Locke wrote, "Whatsoever the mind perceives in itself or is the immediate object of perception, thought, or understanding, I call idea. And the power to produce any idea in our mind, I call quality of the subject wherein the power is." So Locke is saying, look, we want to understand how things work, how the senses deliver He wouldn't have used the word information, but how do the senses provide us knowledge? Well, we have mental representations, which Locke calls ideas. So for John Locke, an idea is not like, oh, I've got an idea. An idea is a mental representation. Idea actually comes from the Greek eidos, which means like what is seen, like a mental image. And the objects have qualities that cause or produce these ideas. So just like I was saying before, the apple has a certain property where it reflects light off of its surface in such a way which causes in me a mental representation of a red apple. Well, what Locke is saying that the apple has a quality that produces in me an idea of a red apple. It's what we would today call a mental representation, but Locke calls it an idea. And what I'm calling properties, Locke is calling qualities. So, yeah, the immediate objects of perception are ideas, not the objects in the world. And they have these qualities, right? But for Locke, there are two kinds of qualities, primary and secondary. Now, this is not original to Locke, but it's pretty important for understanding what he's trying to say. And I mean, Locke is so strongly associated with the notion of primary and secondary qualities that usually when you say Locke, people think of primary and secondary qualities. Or if you say primary and secondary qualities, people think of John Locke. So, what does he mean? The ideas of primary qualities of bodies are resemblances of them, and their patterns do really exist in the bodies themselves. But the ideas produced in us by these secondary qualities have no resemblance to them at all. So primary qualities, Locke is saying, are in the objects themselves, and our sensations, our ideas of those primary qualities, resemble the primary qualities. So what? That's a mouthful, right? Here's what Locke is saying. A primary quality, an idea of a primary quality, like here, look at my coffee mug. I'm investigating the mug. It's solid. So, okay, I have an idea. This object has a quality, solidity, which causes in me an idea of the primary quality of solidity, a mental representation of solidity. Now, my idea of that quality resembles the quality in the object. My mental representation of solidity resembles the solidity of the coffee cup. Secondary qualities, though, produce ideas of secondary qualities in us, and these ideas of secondary qualities do not resemble, are not in the objects. So the redness of the apple is not in the apple. The apple's hardness and the apple's taking up of space, those are primary qualities that are in the apple. And my ideas of those primary qualities resemble the qualities. But my secondary qualities do not resemble the qualities of the object. What color is the apple really? Without a mental representation. I mean, what do you even mean? Right? Without a mind to perceive the apple, what do you even mean? You need a mind to know what things are like. There's no what it's like without a mind to perceive those things. It's kind of similar to Kant, right? How we can never know the noumenal. We can never know the things in themselves. We can only know the phenomena, the way they're presented to us. Similar thing is happening here with Locke. April, go ahead.
So would primary qualities be like material and space that the object takes up, and like secondary qualities would be like color, luminosity, like
Yeah.
surface level.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, Locke gives us a list right here. of primary and secondary qualities. So we have solidity, extension, figure, motion, rest, and quantity. So these are all. Oh, sorry, my doorbell went off. That's probably my food. Tula, come here. Stop barking. Why are you barking at the cat? Tula, come here. Come here. Want a treat? Come here. I'll give you a treat if you stop barking. Oh, okay. Sorry for the barking. Yes, Tula, Tula, come here. Come here. Come here. Stop barking. Okay, so the primary qualities are in the objects, and they can be studied by objective science, right? Science, for example, could tell us about the nature of these objects via these primary qualities. So, solidity, extension, right? Extension in space and time. The shapes of things, whether they're moving or not moving, quantity, all the sorts of things that scientists look at. And Locke says that our ideas of these qualities resemble the qualities of themselves. So the mug is solid, and my experience of the mug is a kind of experience of solidity, right? For example. But secondary qualities are colors, sounds, tastes, sense. They don't exist in the objects, they exist in us. The objects cause the ideas of secondary qualities in us. So our that is why our ideas of secondary qualities don't resemble the objects, right? So a mental representation like color, right? Blueness does not resemble a certain wavelength and frequency of light. Yeah, Kaya, yeah. Social so okay. Primary qualities, yes, are linked to physics. They're the kinds of things a physicist would look at. Secondary qualities, to a certain extent, the way we talk about them, and think about them to a certain extent, there's probably a bit of social construction there. Um, for example, different cultures categorize colors differently. Um, so we think of the ocean as blue. Now, the ancient Greeks, in some of their legendary texts, describe the ocean as wine dark. Now, it doesn't look like anything like wine to me, and I'm not suggesting that the Greeks saw the ocean like the color of red wine or something. That's probably not true. It's just that they categorized colors differently. So, um, yeah, and Quinn, that's probably because there are fewer blue things in nature. I mean, other than the sky and the ocean, um, there are not really many blue animals. Um, so yeah, the way we categorize these colors is a bit different. But I would also say that secondary qualities, while they might have the way we talk about them publicly and the way we conceptualize them might have an element of social construction to it. It's also important to keep in mind that they are mental items, right? Mental representations. Um, so they are, they're not public. The way we talk about them is public, but the mental representations are yours and yours alone, right? But how you categorize those experiences would depend where you live and what language you speak, what time you live at, you know. Um, Another example that I learned about recently was the rainbow. Um, we think of the rainbow as having, what is it, seven colors, something like that. Um, um, in the Old Norse myths, we talk about the Bifrost, right? Everyone calls it Bifrost, but it's Bifrost. The Rainbow Bridge and regular rainbows had three colors. Now, of course, the rainbow has the same number of colors. The rainbows are rainbows wherever they are. But, if you're like some Viking sailing on a ship and you see a rainbow, you're going to say, oh, it's got three colors, because certain colors are categorized differently. We would say it has more colors. We look at the sea and we say, oh, look at the ocean blue. But the Greeks would have said, look at the wine dark sea, right? Um, so yeah, it's a little of both. There was another question I wanted to get to. Um, yeah, I would say, April, the secondary qualities are not like necessarily our interpretation, our mind's interpretation, um, certainly. So, like wavelength of light is what's out there, and color is a mental representation. Frequency of sound waves is what's out there in the world, but pitch is a mental representation, right? So these are all secondary qualities. Same with taste, smells, etc. So Locke says, it is evident that the mind knows not things immediately, but only by the invention of the ideas it has of them. Our knowledge, therefore, is real only so far as there is conformity between our ideas and the reality of things. But what shall be here the criterion? How shall the mind, when it perceives nothing but its own ideas, know they agree with things themselves? So Locke is a realist. He thinks that there are real objects in the world. And he's a representative realist at that, because all of our ideas are mental representations. But what do we do? There's a worry here. What do we do? Um, what when it comes to the question of what we know? If all the mind has are mental representations, how do I know when those mental representations agree with reality? This is related to Descartes' dream argument, right? How does Descartes know if he's dreaming or not? Well, he says he can't. He can't know whether his mental representations um, accord with the world, like when it normally does when we're awake, or whether they don't, like when we're dreaming or when we're hallucinating, right? Well, Chloe, this is an important thing to keep in mind. Um, for Locke, the primary qualities are in the object, and our ideas of those primary qualities are mental representations, and they resemble the primary qualities in the object. So there are primary qualities like solidity, and then my idea of that primary quality, my mental representation of the solidity, which resembles the object. But when it comes to secondary qualities, ideas do not resemble the properties of the objects. Locke thinks we would. Then again, go back to Descartes' dream argument, right? This could be a dream coffee cup. In a dream, it might still feel solid, even though there is no coffee cup. I mean, this is the whole point of that scene in The Matrix, right? And I know I talk about The Matrix a lot, but when Neo is going to see the Oracle, and there are all these candidates who might be the one, and there's this one kid who's bending the spoon with his mind, and Neo's all like, whoa. And then the kid is like, okay, you don't bend the spoon. You can't bend the spoon. You just have to realize that there is no spoon. It's just a mental representation, right? Can we always change the secondary qualities? Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, you could change. Yeah, I don't see why not. You could paint your apple blue, and now it's got a different quality. Although you don't want to paint your apples, but something else. Like imagine your car, right? You want to you've got one of those horrible tan colored cars, right? So you're like, you know what, this thing needs a paint job. So you paint it red, right? Now you've changed a property of the car. But keep in mind that your idea of the secondary quality does not resemble the object itself. So next time we're going to try and focus on some of these problems in further detail, and then we'll look at phenomenalism or subjective idealism, the view of George Berkeley, who says that, well, there aren't any real objects, there are only ideas. So that's phenomenalism, or in Berkeley's case, factual phenomenalism or subjective idealism. Are there any questions? Oh, another bit of housekeeping that I forgot. I will be making an announcement on this. I need to make an announcement on the correct due date for the essay because in my slides it's due on the last day of the exam period. It's actually due in November. I will make an announcement to that effect. I'm also going to share my policy on I'm going to share the generative AI policy because one thing I forgot to mention in my lecture on essay writing was, and this is in the course outline, I reserve the right to ask for proof of student work or to ask you about the steps you took when writing your essay, for example. So, what I'm going to do is ask that you submit drafts of your paper along with your final draft or some other proof of work. This is a way for me to know that I don't have to worry about any use of generative AI. So, I'll post an announcement about that. But it's something that I thought I would mention now since I've got an extra couple of minutes. But as for today's material, we've got 3 minutes or so. Do you have any questions? Well, I don't really care how the drafts are formatted. I really just need proof um that you did the work, right? So you can just save your drafts. Like you could have a folder and you could have like draft one, draft two, draft three, like that kind of thing. Just save a different copy every time, or every other time you sit down to work on your paper, just so that I know that you've done the work. Or if you have like handwritten notes or whatever, right? Save all of your work. Yeah, that's right, Cormac. I need some proof of some steps that you took to complete the essay. It really, look, to be frank, I'm not going to mince words. It sucks that I have to do this. Um, and I do believe that the use of ChatGPT will be very minimal, if at all. But it's just unfortunate that this kind of technology has just changed the game, and now this is something I have to do. So it's not like I don't trust you all. I just have to do my due diligence. And that's why I will be asking for proof of your work. It's not you, it's the machines, okay? It's the machines. All right, well, that's all I can think of, unless there are any other questions. Yeah, drafts. You'll want to submit some drafts with the final paper. And you can do this in the Dropbox. There will be room for multiple submissions. So or you can put everything in like a zip file. That might work. Actually, let me get back to you on that. I'm not sure if that'll work. But in any case, I know you could upload like a middle draft, an almost finished draft, and then a final draft. And, if I have like two or three drafts, that's probably good. Okay, you can upload zip files. That's good to know. Yeah, and then my TAs and I, we can just download them, open them. We can see the drafts, we can see the final version, etc. Well, that about does it. That's all I have for today. So we'll finish up chapter 5 next time. We'll talk about Bishop Berkeley's subjective idealism. So should be fun. Okay, to clarify, is it representative realism just elaborating on the fact that sense data has to be constructed instead of being okay, so with direct realism, as Crumley is treating it, um, or with indirect realism, it's indirect because sense data, I think the way I read it is that they're ultimately information. So we're indirectly in contact with the world. Um, Representative realism is a causal representational view. So on representational realism, we're not talking about sense data. We're talking about properties in the objects that cause things to happen in our minds. Yeah, I'll be looking at the drafts for marking. I mean, I want to see how your ideas develop. A greater difference in quality between the draft and your final will indicate that you've really done a good job, right? But I won't be marking the drafts themselves. They are mostly so that I can see um, that you've done the work. Okay, well, that's it. I better get going. Well, you don't lose necessarily, but I will probably bug you for a draft. Like I am telling you now that you will need to submit drafts. There's no not submitting a draft. That will be a red flag. Like if you don't submit a draft, I'm gonna be like, why didn't they? Could be written by AI, right? So I am that's why I'm telling you all. And I will post an announcement about this later this week. All right, thanks everyone. I will see you on Thursday. Bye for now.